Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. I wanted to bring up the topic of reparations. About a year ago, there was a lot of challenges in some circles, specific within the Muslim community, with regard to addressing the issue of white supremacy. And I think that now, given the events and the circumstances, a lot of people have come to a point where they're acknowledging certain things existing that they may not have been predisposed or not ready or open to having a conversation about or even acknowledging. Now there's an acknowledgement that there's a problem. The situation of police brutality is not only a systemic issue from the angle of how the law is applied. And there's something that's called discretionary power reading the law. And officers, they have the ability to read the law and apply it within their parameters of work. They can read the law and apply it. So they can give one person a break, and they can, basically warn another person, or they can take another person to court, basically give them a ticket or whatever it may be, or they can arrest the person as an officer of the law. That's what you call the discretionary power of reading the law. A lot of people don't know that this is where a lot of problems occur, aside from systemic issues. You've had a group of police officers. There was a case study on that in New York, in the New York area, and they happened to be people of African descent and Latinos. They came out and they talked about how it was that they were pushed to deal with the Black and the Latino community in a specific way. And so that showed that, for instance, it's not only the individual officer that is reading the law in a certain way and applying it, but there's the case that there's a policy in a particular district that may be instituted. And then there's levels to that. We can keep going on and on of the sentencing and so on and so forth. And actually, stay tuned, because we're going to bring on a brother who's a lawyer, and he wrote the book Raw Law. He's a Muslim brother, African-American brother. We're going to try to do a Zoom with him, and I've been kind of holding off so that he could talk about some of the legal issues that involve themselves in these types of situations, or some of the legal issues that are involved in these types of situations. But as we noted, about a year ago, there was a lot of uproar, especially within the circles that we roll in, a lot of us brothers online and so on and so forth. And there was a push, and even it became a dialogue amongst imams and so on and so forth with regard to the issue of white supremacy. And it spilled out into a conversation with other communities, and people didn't like some of the things that were mentioned. But now, about a year later, I think people are put in a silenced mode where they don't know what to say, what to do, except attack Black Lives Matters as an organization, as LGBT and so on and so forth. That's kind of where they're at on that. And it's the same issue that Muslims, they learn terms, they throw them around, and they're far from reality. They're far from reality theoretically, because they don't make up terms. They're far from reality theoretically because they don't construct a way of understanding the world. And they're far politically because they're actually not really involved except some really lightweight lobbying, And so the Muslims are far from being social activists in the real sense as a group. There's individuals that have been committed a long time. There's also, a distance between the Muslims and really understanding how to process life and process what's going on. And so there's always this claim to moral superiority, that's being waged in some circles as a substitute for actual thought. Meaning, you can't constantly just talk about a moral point in the halal haram. Is an extension of halal haram discussion that we have as Muslims, and you make that as the end all be all conversation with regard to what goes on in society or politics or economics and so on and so forth. And so we find a lot of Muslims have intellectually just aligned themselves with the system as it is. I'm very critical on this stuff, and I personally, am not. I'll take the consequences. That's the reality. I'll take the consequences of that in dealing with the Muslim community. But somebody has to, and it's not that I'm claiming to be like a sacrificial lamb. I'm saying all of us really, but somebody has to just be honest with the situation if we want to talk about bettering the condition of human beings. So there's a lot to be said in that regard, that Muslims really don't understand what's going on and how to really process, except on the individual basis. But the general tendency in the communities is one of ignorance. And then there's another aspect, is that there's one of arrogance. And so some people interact with the community. Like, you have small business owners in the inner city. They see what goes on. They see what goes on a lot of levels, but they take the position of, arrogance, and moral superiority. And I know that I'm speaking from experience as well as analysis. When you have a store owner and you're in the hood and you're selling Easy Widers and you're selling Black and Milds and you're selling marijuana paraphernalia and you're selling, synthetic marijuana and everything else, because you feel that falls within the halal realm, and then you call blacks abd, you're part of the problem. And I've mentioned this before, and this is a scenario, that a lot of people don't like to touch because it becomes very sensitive. So what? But at the end of the day, are we talking about Islam? Are we talking about justice? Are we talking about human beings? But then even with the concept of justice, there is a tendency of excluding people from the circle or the parameters of justice. So if something goes on in a particular part of the Muslim world, then we all have to rally our money and our attention and this and that. And I'm not against people, standing with people in their causes. Don't get me wrong on this. You know what I'm saying? And I'm taking responsibility. That's why I'm saying But, we have to have a wider sense of justice. And so I gave that example of the store, and it's a known example by a lot of us, to say that, there's a different position that has to be taken. That's just a proof of how Muslims analyze things and how distant we really are from people's suffering. So in those situations, if you come from a background in which you're exploited, in which you're oppressed, so you're going to say, what the hell, now is my turn to exploit and oppress and unleash hell on people, because I've been oppressed, and I find myself in the opportunity to, put my head above water. And so it's going to be the rule of, survival of the fittest. Herbert Spencer, under the cloth of Darwin, survival of the fittest. That's the rule of the game, the Machiavellian type of, ethics. And so that's why I said that we're not in a position or a predicament to really deal with these issues, that we have to change our philosophy. And I'm speaking, and I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it more clearly. I'm speaking from like 15 years of being an imam to some brothers that was their issue. They were in the hood and they had those types of stores, and a lot of them tried to clean up and, and make amends and make it through the system and put themselves in a better situation. Some of them didn't give a damn, and I've watched brothers get shot up over that stuff. I'm talking about some of our Muslim brothers. There was one brother that was a congregant. He used to come to my Jummah. And I mentioned this in other lives, but I'm just telling you how serious this stuff is. And the brother, when I was in Chicago, I got a call. He was killed. He was killed in a robbery of the drive-through alcohol store. And he was, and he was one of those types of brothers that people say he's a good brother. He goes to Jummah, this, that. But that's the reality of getting caught in the game. So let me be fair here now. This is what happens with the Muslims, is they get caught in the game. Right, removing responsibility. Now I'm not going to say that, look, you're in the hood and you're messing up the situation and you're a part of the problem. Now I'm moving away from that type of discussion, because I think that's a valid discussion to have too. Sometimes we have to confront ourselves and each other and say we're part of the problem. But then there's the other side of, like, I understand you're caught in the catch-22 in the game of survival, right? You're caught in the game, of survival. And so then if you're caught in the game of survival, right, how is it, that how is it that we can manage as Muslims and support each other to come out of that game of survival and be people of justice? That becomes the question. So now I'm going to go into another reflection, and this is the core of this reflection. I said all of that to say that intellectually, emotionally, existentially, meaning where we're at in existence, a lot of us are not ready to deal with these problems. You understand what I'm saying? That we're facing because we're caught up, you know, in the hustle, as Mortal Technique says. I'm caught up in the hustle, right? And so it's like the rapper Jay Electronica said, you know, life is like a dice roll. You know what I'm saying? You know, you can either, you know, with one roll, you can end up okay in the suburbs, or you can end up, you know, somewhere, you know, in jail, right? And that's what happens when we don't take Islam as our guidance. When we leave it up to the conditions of the moment, it becomes like we're taking a chance with ourselves and other people's lives, and we're trying to see if we fall well. We're trying to see if we fall well. And that's the condition that a lot of us are in. You know what I'm saying? We're happy to have made it out. You know, we're happy to, you know, we went through these struggles and we're hoping to make it out. You know, and that's the same thing with the immigrant coming across the water looking for a better life, or the brother in the projects. You know, he takes up the gun and he's like, yo, I gotta feed my family. You know, I hope I come back. You know, those are decisions that are not good decisions. But that's what happens in a world where Islam has no real role. People start to make decisions that are problematic. And it happens in a world where human beings are put to the side, because everybody's not going to be Muslim, where the rule of law becomes each man for himself, or each person for themselves, where individualism becomes what's dominant. And so there has to be some intellectual changes. And part of the intellectual change that has to take place is that, look, now that we're becoming conscious, and even the store owner that was practicing some sort of racism on the corner of the block is coming to a consciousness that's not acceptable. You know what I'm saying? Or the store gets shut down, or there's consequences, that type of stuff. You know, where do we go from there? You know, there's two things before I get into this. There's two things. One is the issue of how do we think about community as Muslims? How do we think about community? And I think that this whole concept of now we go and we're talking about, you know, anti-racism and this and that, that's a bunch of not. Look, the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us that. So if we're going to sit here, we have to do workshops. You know, I don't find sincerity in that. Workshops after people's stores getting looted and this and that. Now all of a sudden we want to do workshops as a community. And I'm not knocking the sincerity of effort, but I'm saying that, look, that's not going to happen. That transformation is not going to happen. People have to learn their deen. And they have to begin to learn that, okay, I may not like the beauty in this person. She may not attract me, or he may not attract me. Those are not the physical features that I like. But I don't have a right to take away from the dignity of that person, as a human being. I'm fine. You stay with your tribe. You know what I'm saying? No problem. We should, you know, we should not be against people if they want to stay with their tribe. But what we should be against if people dehumanizing other people. You know, that's an issue. People dehumanizing other people. And so that, you know, that's something that's important. But where do we go? You know, we have to do a self-analysis on really understanding Islam. You know, we could do workshops on racism, anti-racism, right? But what I'm saying is that that's not going to be any different than the civil rights legislation. You make some modifications and changes, but the reality stays in place. This is deep-seated people. This is part of people's aqidah. And it's stronger than what they believe in when it comes to the unseen. You know, when you see tons of dollars spent on skin bleachers, and if we bring out the analysis, the economic analysis, and we see what countries are buying what portion or percentage, and how much money goes into it, we'll get a real deep understanding of where the psychology is at with this. So that's why I say just sitting around doing a workshop on anti-racism is not going to solve this problem. And it's not my responsibility or your responsibility at this point of holding somebody's hand not to be racist. You understand what I'm saying? But what is our responsibility is to stand up for some sort of justice. So if we want to get to the root cause of this, people's psychological transformation, that's a process, is a work in progress. What we need is the public sphere to be just. And part of that public sphere being just is that if the Muslims really want to do anything, and if the Muslims want to write in their book of deeds as a Jama'ah in history, before Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala society, then the Muslims should stand for reparations. The Muslims should stand for reparations. You know, that's the reality at the end of the day. Because part of police brutality is that you have conditions that have created violence in certain environments. Right? And this is always the excuse of the right. But what? Why don't you talk about black on black crime? All that type of stuff. I said, yeah, I'll talk about black on black crime. And that includes black and brown together. That's systemic injustice. Economic conditions that were created because of policies that were not nationalistic. The capitalists were not nationalistic when they decided to send those factories overseas and empty out American cities of jobs, right? And so that's what black and brown encountered. You know, where was the decision making if it was nationalists? And I'm talking on the part of white nationalists. If they really loved America, if they loved the U.S., if they had a sense of American nationalism as they claim, why was it that they defunded the school systems, meaning making the school system tax-based, knowing that the economic situation or the income of many families that live in a lot of urban centers is not capable of maintaining a school system which will allow you to compete in capitalist society? During the Clinton administration, there was a point that was released on this, that in order to really succeed in America, in the U.S. properly, because that's another issue. You know, America is all of the Americas: North America, South America, the Caribbean, Central America. You know, that's America, the Americas. You know, but the U.S. reality is that, you know, in order to survive, you have to be from upper middle class. Now 100,000 in New York is poverty line if you have 4 people in your family. And so if you have an educational system that's predicated, its success predicated upon the tax dollars, and if you know that these neighborhoods don't have the ability to support their people economically, and you didn't prepare your people. Look, Bill Gates, he decided to export, you know, Microsoft to other places in the world. So when he comes on the scene and talks about, you know, what should happen in the world, you didn't give a damn about your country. You exported jobs. You could have made inner cities a professional hub. You could have made rural white America, you know, a professional hub for computer and tech. But he decided that he was going to export because it was about the profit line. So, you know, when we start talking about nationalism and this and that, you know, we need to correct ourselves on what we mean. There's nothing wrong with building your nation. Saudi Arabia, didn't it just shut down air travel? Completely shut it down. Didn't it restrict people from movement based upon what they consider is a national security issue for the nation under the health issue? So don't get me, you know, with this issue of nation, you know, and as we're on the topic of nation, that's part of the problem that's in the African American community. It's the same issue that happened with the indigenous Native Americans. You know, the part of the problem in the African American community is they were promised certain things. You know, if they were people that happened to be caught up in war and they were enslaved, then when that slavery was ended, there should have been something in place to ensure that the damage that was done was repaired. There was reparations to allow that community to develop itself. There wasn't even the space that allowed that community to develop itself. When we look at Black Wall Street, it's not that they couldn't develop themselves. If they would have just been left alone and given the freedom without intervention, without warfare of attrition, you know, that community could have developed. And so the Muslims, if they want to do anything, you know what I'm saying, part of the issue should be to get behind reparations to ensure that that community can develop itself. And that will address police brutality at the root. Because there will be no need for brutality if the economic conditions of a community is such where you are not plagued by criminality because people have what they need to work, what they need to survive. because the law of the jungle doesn't prevail. And that's not to paint black communities as such, because they're not like that across the board. But it's because that's the first thing that what comes into people's minds with policing and so on and so forth. Then I need to address that issue, address that psychology. If we want to talk about that, that's the core issue. The issue of economic standing in some of these cities. The other issue, we mentioned it already, which is an application of the law, which is not correct, profiling and so on and so forth. But without addressing the issue of reparations, there's no, especially with the wealth, there's no way to move forward. You know, what's going to happen after these protests is going to stay to be a problematic situation. Look, in the 60s, the Kennedy administration, the response, you know, that came to the riots of the 60s and all of that happened to be, you know, policies that came in to uplift communities. Right. And the presidency after Kennedy, the same thing. And that's what opened up the door to bad policing and so on and so forth. That was one of those issues in which the administration, rather than taking a justice approach, it took a strong-armed approach. But in general, the spirit was in a good direction. And that was to look at people's economic and social circumstances and situations. So people will say, well, brother, but there's criminality, there's this, there's that. Yeah, but if you invest in the school system, and you invest in people's economic situations, then you have the ability to start correcting issues. We know that education and incarceration leads to a decrease in the recidivism rate, just as an example. So if people, like during the time of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, education in the prison system was a major thing, because it was about, you know, transforming people. It wasn't punitive solely. And so that allowed people to never come back because they had the tools. And so in order to correct this situation, we have to look at systemic issues, and it's going to, you know, come back to some sort of reparations package, some sort of real deal, you know, liberation package, some sort of compensation, some sort of upliftment that goes beyond just words and the changing of few laws and some behavior. And that's what the Muslims, if the Muslims are about justice, that's what the Muslims should get behind. See, and there's a lot of Muslims that don't feel. There's European American Muslims that don't feel the need. You know, and I've had these debates with brothers. Feel the need. That's because they don't really understand the issues, or they don't really want to address the issues, or they don't really want to stand on the side of justice. But you can't talk about the situation of a people as is, and there's no way to correct it. There's no way to stabilize certain things except by way of changes in law and economic justice. So that's what, you know, I think that we as a community should really push, you know, as a discourse, that we should move beyond just the issue of protesting. I'm not saying stop the protesting, you know, and I'm not saying, you know, stop other means of pushing for social change. But there has to be, you know, a push for reparations. This is coming up on the ballot, and the Muslims should support it. That's the bottom line. And if we don't get that sort of economic justice, you know, the problems will continue as they are. That's part of the problem that we're seeing, is that communities need to be economically empowered so that they have the ability to grow and address their own issues. The other issue that needs to be considered is that, you know, policing needs to take a completely different turn. And in Chicago, you know, there is the proposal of civilian-controlled policing. You know, and that is basically policing that is controlled democratically by civilians, and that they have power over how policing takes place. And that, you know, what that does is that allows a community to have a discussion on what's working, what's not working, versus having the police as an insular group, you know. And I think that at minimum, that more real community dialogue needs to go into how policing takes place, with more oversight. And that's even, within the interest of police officers themselves, because we have to admit the society is violent. The society that we live in is extremely violent. And so we have to have real dialogues about, community policing. And then even more so, we have to, and I'm not talking about just advisory boards. I'm talking about real, what does it mean to be, involved as a community? And that brings us to the last point that I want to cover. That brings us to the point of functional neighborhoods. When you have neighborhoods that are functional, those neighborhoods police themselves. People care. They care about their property. They care about the safety in the community. They care about what goes on. And so when, communities, when there's issues that take place where, neighborhoods are broken and not, the funding is not there, and criminality rises and so on and so forth, and people are isolated and people have issues that are not addressed and so on and so forth, that leads to the breakdown of those communities, and it leads to a situation in which people think that the only way to solve that is by hardline policing, and that's not going to work, because there are deeper social issues as to why communities are unraveling and in a bad situation. And so, we want to leave it on that note, saying that, we have a deep necessity as a Muslim community to get to the root of things. We're part of this society. We need to really start taking a stance. I'm personally pro reparations, especially for the African American communities. I'm pro reparations for the situation of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is one of the oldest colonies in the world, and there's a lot more that's taken from Puerto Rico than is given back. But in this case right now, we're talking about reparations for the African American community. It needs to come as a solid package. And there's enough studies that have been done on that. And I think that that's part of what should be on the list of demands. We want to talk about really moving forward and what we want and how to correct this situation. Yes, if you have a problem with black people because you see them impoverished and you think that they act ignorantly, and this is some of the attitude of you people that you claim that you're Muslims, then, why don't you move to correct the situation? It's not an issue of laziness. Why don't you move to correct the situation? If you have a problem with looking at a person that has some issues, you know what I'm saying? And then why don't you move to correct it? Get to the core of it. And part of getting to the core of this situation is, changing attitudes, changing relationships, and changing economic status. If we really want to make a real total change. It's not enough to talk about racism in the Muslim community, but the Muslim community has to stand for something of justice, right? And there's a lot of prejudices that are there, and it's a reality that are there in the Muslim community. And a lot of that stuff comes back to people themselves. When you can't see a human being, and I'm definitely ending on this note, and you value that human being, whoever they are, you have an issue with yourself. Because you should be able to value a human being, if you're a person of Iman. Regardless of where they come from, you should be able to see the humanity in them, and you acknowledge that state of Islam that they're in. Because they're the creation of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, right? And so that's something, they're the makhluk of Allah. And so you should be able to acknowledge that which Allah has created, which is good. And then if you see a person that's broken on other levels, that's where we have the revelation to correct the situation. And that's something that is necessary to understand. Revelation is there to correct the situation. If you're in areas in which you're seeing impoverishment and you see brokenness and this and that, that's why I said, it's not enough to sit there and just be judgmental while you're making money in those neighborhoods and you're driving away in your Lexus or your Tesla or your Mercedes-Benz or your Range Rover or whatever it is. And then that's the attitude that you have, is like, look at these people. Like, what did you contribute back? Did you even stop for a moment to think about why those conditions are the way that they are? And that, that's part of the problem with the Muslims. Like, in the same thing on the social level, overall, maybe you may not be there, in those types of urban environments. But if you're in that situation where you're looking, you're saying, like, why are these people doing this? Like, why are they looting? They should get themselves together, respect private property. Have you stopped to think about why the situation is that it is? You know, and that's something that's extremely important. It's like you have to go beyond just appearances. You know, and the Muslims are the least to have these conversations. In other words, you're not justified. That's what I mean by that. Because you know what it's like for people to discriminate against you for being Muslim. So you should take that, what you experience, and you should put that on a group of people, you know, that a whole society thinks that it's okay to kick them in the butt. It's okay to talk negatively about them, as long as I'm not those people. And in the meantime, everybody is celebrating, you know, words that come from that community and music that comes from that community, you know, and cultural things that come from that community, but they hate the people, you know. And let's be solid on this. I'll leave you with this. A lot of people love to be black when it comes to culture, but you don't love black people, or you don't love being black if it means that you have to suffer.